All right. Okay. Um, Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to those watching online and to everyone that stopped by our table today and chatted with us and had some stories to share. We really appreciate you all and connecting with the community on this project. That's what it's all about. So we are the Oak Hill Cemetery Pottersfield Community Remembrance Project. A bit of a mouthful, not a very good acronym to come up with, but we persevere anyways. And so today we're hosting a history harvest at the library, and now we just want to give a little presentation about this project, sort of some of the background about it, and present some of the updates to the work that we've been doing. So real quick, here is our project team. Forgot to introduce myself. My name is Caleb Latas. I am the project director. Part of our team is Dr. Blair Schneider, a geologist. We have Donna Ray Pearson, a historian, a scholar. We have Carrie, who's here with us as well, local historian, John Brown impersonator. And then part of our team is Larry Hoyle, who's a great community volunteer. And then Steve Nowak with the Watkins Museum. They've been our sponsor on this project. And Steve and his team have just been such an incredible help to this work that we're doing. This work would not be possible if it wasn't for the funding that we've received from the Douglas County Heritage Conservation Council and Humanities Kansas. That money makes this work possible and helps fund what we hope to do with this project. And so that being said, our main goals are memorialization, collaboration, and education. And so that funding goes towards these efforts. So the funding will help us to develop signs, which we will have out at the Potter's Field that'll help memorialize everyone buried there with their names and date of birth, date of death. And on those signs, we're going to have QR codes that are linked to a podcast that we're going to create. And that's going to help tell the stories. And so that's what the point of these history harvests are, is to learn more about the lives of those buried in the Potter's Field, and to retell their stories and let them be known again. And real quick, our project, it's all about the community. It's all about protection and care. And so we performed a geophysical survey 2 summers ago. So that's a non-invasive survey that we use to help figure out where the Potter's Field is sort of located within that space to help identify where possible burials are. But it's about using that to connect it with the information about the people themselves. So real quick, some of you may be wondering what a Potter's Field is. And so that is a section of the cemetery, or it can even be its own separate cemetery. It's where people who couldn't afford a proper burial were buried. So those who couldn't afford to have their own lot and their own headstone and all that, they were buried in unmarked graves, often in kind of the northeast section of a cemetery. Some of the Potter's Fields do have headstones. So if you've ever been out to the Oak Hill Cemetery, you might have noticed in that northeast corner, what looks like an open field with a few headstones. That's the Potter's Field. But some of those headstones were installed by the families so that they could celebrate the lives of those that they had lost. But some of them don't have a headstone, but their lives were still just as important. So this project originally started a couple years ago, pre-pandemic. And so the work started to find the burials of the 3 men that were lynched. They were buried in the Potter's Field. And so the NAACP, sorry, still in March Madness mode. The NAACP started this project, and many of you may have attended their unveiling of the memorial marker for those men. And so they had asked us to be a part of this project, to use that geophysical survey to help find where they were buried. And so from that, we grew to work to memorialize all those that were buried there in the Potter's Field. And so I'll turn things over to Blair to talk about that geophysical survey.
Thanks. All right. Hi, everyone. So I have some updates to share with you in terms of the geophysics and the progress that we've made to date. It is a long process because there's a lot of data, but we collected ground penetrating radar. Very simple version of ground penetrating radar. It's using like radio waves. We send a signal into the ground, it interacts with what's underneath the soil, returns something back, we receive it, and make some interpretations. Electrical resistivity and electrical conductivity. So those are just telling us, is the soil below the surface really conductive, like a clay, or is it more resisting that current, which would be more like your sands and gravels? So it tells us about the subsurface soils. And susceptibility is actually a form of, it tells us about the magnetic properties. So if someone was buried here with some sort of metal object or like metal buttons, if there was metal in a casket or coffin, we would actually be able to pick those kinds of things up as well. So we chose those methods. And this is a photo of our amazing crew. At the time, we had so many wonderful volunteers. And if any of them are watching, I just want to say thank you one more time for all of your help, because this project couldn't have been done without you. But this is what we started with, actually, and we didn't even start with this to begin with. When I first met with Carrie to talk about this project, we didn't know anything about the site. We talked about starting, and then COVID hit, so we had to delay our delay of the project. And during that time, they found this map, which was kind of, a sign almost, right, that we needed to do this work. And so this was a map drawn. It's a little hard to see in the light here. I don't know if it's possible to like turn down the lights somewhere. I'm gonna run over here real fast. I think there's some lights over there. Let me see if that'll work. But basically, we don't know much about who drew this map or when it was drawn or where they got the information from. But we just know that this is in the northeast part of the field. Yeah, that was better. Northeast part of the field. And if you look at the bottom down here, it appears that most of the graves, they were thinking there was about 200 or 300, were here on the western side of the fields. But it appeared that this whole portion of the potter's field did have like lots aligned for it. So we were focusing really heavily on thinking like, okay, where is this part, the western edge of the potter's field? Because this is where we seem to have the biggest concentration of graves. And so when we came out, the red boundary there is where we were thinking the potter's field boundary was. And so we did a survey that extended beyond that, particularly to the north. I thought I had lined it up well on the south, but I'm just a little bit off. But so we were trying to make sure we were covering anything that would have gone outside. To date, when we look at it today, there's a couple of headstones. Get this mouse back over here. There we go. There it is. There's still a couple of headstones at the surface today, and there's about 2 trees. I'm sure that there are more trees at some point in the past, and so I just say that because when I'm going through the geophysics data, I have to kind of be cognizant of, what did it look like before here? If there's like tree roots and stuff like that are still down there, we'll see that in the data also. And we really butt up right against this wooded area here. So as we get closer again on the east side here, something to be cognizant of is those trees, and any kind of activity going on in there will start to impact my data as well. And so again, looking at that, I'm really anticipating that there's going to be a lot of activity over here, more on the western side of my grid. The resistivity results that we got, these were basically, resistivity is really awesome because it gives me good horizontal resolution. And basically this was just about half meter below the surface. So all the way across the board, we see that there's lower resistivity. Keep losing this mouse. There's lower resistivity along the southern portion of this grid, and then as we move more north, it gets more resistive. And so this was really useful information for me because I wasn't particularly using this to try and detect graves in the first place. I'm trying to use this to tell me about the subsurface soils. And it actually gives me some good detailed information. So this is a soil map from the NRCS. And what you're looking at here, this is where our grid is, right here. And so our grid is sitting on top of 2 types of soil units. The goldish color there is the base ore complex. Both of these are silty loams, so a little bit rough for radar, but we can still do it. But so we've got the base ore complex at the north side, and then we've got the Sibleyville complex on the south side. And the biggest thing to note here is that if you look at this, the depth to bedrock on average, and that base core is pretty shallow. I mean, we're talking like 30 centimeters on average depth to bedrock. When we get in down to that Sibleyville complex, it's a little bit deeper, about 70 centimeters, but still pretty shallow. So bedrock here is limestone. It's part of the Douglas group, I believe. And so if we do have burials here, one thing I'm knowing from the beginning is that the resistance data supported that. It's shallower to bedrock at the north side, a little bit deeper to bedrock on the south side. And if they were burying individuals here, we're not following the 6 feet rule that we know today. They would have had to have been buried pretty shallowly before they were hitting that bedrock and making it really difficult to dig. So conductivity data. What was nice about the conductivity data, it was similar to what we saw with the resistance. So if you note, so the purplish gray values are higher conductivity and the black values are lower conductivity. Resistance and conductivity are inverses of each other. So we see the same pattern as we move north. But you can also see these striped images right here, these little striped patterns. Those seem to correspond pretty well with what those lots, that lot map showed. Very tight spacing and really concentrated on the west side of the plot here. And then lastly, the susceptibility data, this is that magnetic data. If there's metal below the ground, same types of patterns. We can see rows in our data here with these what looks like individual plots. We've got this really high anomaly over here that I'm still investigating. I'm working on that one. I don't know what metallic thing is buried over there, but there's something over there. So these give me a good idea that yes, there's something here. I think the best of the data sets here was the magnetic susceptibility, telling me that yes, there's a concentration here, but we still definitely have some activity up on the eastern side of this plot. And again, when we first collected this, we still thought there was only 200 or 300 people here. Caleb's going to give you an update on that one. Going through the radar data is the most exciting part and the most difficult part of this work. So I'm just going to start by showing you those few headstones that we do have at the site. Here's what the data looks like. So here's the GPR data at Moses' headstone. And so this little red triangle right here, that's where we put a marker when we were crossing by his headstone. And as you cross over his headstone, you get these upside down, you get these frowny faces. Those are called diffractions. And if you run over a target, you'll get a diffraction back with the radar. Key point there though, that could be Moses, that could be a rock, that could be a tree root, right? I can't tell you exactly what that target is, but we're definitely hitting something there. And because we're right in front of his headstone, pretty good indication that there's Moses there. And if we look to the sides of Moses's headstone, we see other diffractions in there actually as well, which is indicative that there's probably other people buried in this same line here. We have a headstone, one of a baby, and then one of a 9-year-old. And so this is on the east side of that one. And so here we can see some, gosh, I wish I had, there we go. We can see those right here, really nice diffractions right there actually. And then those, but that's not the baby and the 9-year-old, sorry. Those are markers right here. So we see one here that I'm calling a pretty good maybe. This one, I wouldn't, like, if I didn't know that there was a headstone there, I don't know that I would say it for sure that there's someone there. But I will also say if it's a baby, that's a much smaller target. And if there's anything there left to image, makes that more difficult today too. And then J.W. Dolan, that is another headstone that we can actually see today. We can see that diffraction as we're coming across here. And then same thing, look at all these other diffractions along that line. There's definitely targets along these spaces. But to show you how difficult it is, Elizabeth Ashley and Mary Jane, who do have 2 more modern headstones out there today, I don't think we figured out yet when we think that those were placed or if we're sure if they're in the right spot or not. They are right next to one of the 2 trees that's out there. And this is a really good example of this is what tree roots look like. So being able to tell the difference between that and a headstone is very difficult, but we're pretty fortunate because there's only 2 trees in our survey area. So that's where I know I have headstones. And so now this is the hard part that Caleb and I are working through. So what you're looking at here, this line right here in black, this is our first grid right here. It's about 20 meters long. And this is where we don't anticipate having any burials. And so this is what a radar line would look like. We don't think we have anything there. That's a pretty standard radar line. Now, it might just look like wiggles to you, but to me, I see that as just kind of like quiet, natural subsoil. Nothing's really happening there. As we start to move into the grid, so this is about 16.5 meters east into that first grid, we start seeing a lot more activity. In particular, this is a pattern that I'm really noticing across the survey area, is this kind of clustering of diffractions. Now, we think that these lots were only about 2 feet apart, and we're dealing with meters down here, right? So it makes sense that we're kind of starting to see this clustering, but they're so close that it's almost like they're buried in the exact same lots. So that's been a pretty consistent pattern. They've been pretty shallow across the board within just a 5 to 10 nanosecond time frame. But I've gotten a couple that are a little bit deeper, kind of noted here in blue, but amplitude's much lower. Here's an example moving further north into grid 4. So grid 4 is where we have Moses's headstone. Another example of that clustering that I'm seeing there, and it's all within that same lot. So I'm keeping an eye, and it seems to be more on the, here you go, on the right-hand side of this too, or the more northern side. We kind of thought everything started, we thought Moses would be the first row based on the map that we have, but even before we hit Moses, I'm getting some evidence here. This stands out to me. This is right at the surface. So I'm almost wondering if this high amplitude response here isn't maybe a buried marker, a buried headstone. We did find one buried headstone when we were actually collecting the data that we didn't know was out there. So that would actually be pretty typical of that. And then we also have these 2 diffractions right below it. So actually these plots actually go further west than we originally thought. And then here's the hard parts. So the original plot map that we saw, we thought everything would be focused on the west. Caleb's going to give you an update on, there's a lot more people there than what we originally thought. And so I'm moving further and further west, and wow. So this is this line right here. We're up in grid 6, again, 20 meters across. And first and foremost, you see this right here. I'm thinking that this is actually this line, this dipping line right here is actually that bedrock interface. And so we see it getting shallower as we go north, but look at the number of diffractions in there. It's almost impossible to tease out where are the individual lots, but then also I'm getting way closer to those trees. So maybe we have some tree roots that are actually extending this far out. And so we have to kind of go out and do some more surveying to figure that out. But there's a lot of activity along the western edge of this cemetery that we didn't really recognize before. And so this is the process we're working through. It's slow but steady. One of the end products I'm hoping to make is identifying each of those individual targets and then having like a map on the top showing you the orientation of the targets, if they connect, how long they are, and the number of them. And that's where I'm at. I'll turn it back over to Caleb.
All right. So as Blair was saying, so that original map that we were working off of had around 300-ish people on there. But as we know now, from going through the records, from looking at previous research that's been done by the Douglas County Geological Society, we know that that number is actually about 1,000. And so that means that there's about 700 people that weren't included on that original map. So at first we were going through online records that we had found. And those were actually reproductions of the original records. But we've been working with the city, and they have given us access to digital copies of those original records. And so those records are for all of Oak Hill, every burial. So it's time consuming going through and finding all the ones for the Potter's Field. But we are very fortunate in that the Potter's Field, that those records were not only recorded in the first place, but saved, because a lot of Potter's Fields aren't always as fortunate. Even a lot of cemeteries aren't always as fortunate to still have the records around. And so we're going through there, identifying everyone who's buried there. And those records include lots of incredible information about who they were, and we can use that to help connect them, to family trees, but also those start to give us glimpses into their life stories. So if you imagine that map that we looked at, here's an updated version of that I've made in Excel with everyone's name. So as you can see, it's a lot more full than that original map was. And this is actually only a fraction of it. It's really hard to compress an entire Excel document to make it legible on the screen. But this gives you a little bit of a better view. So this is the entire Potter's Field according to that original map. And so this shows where people are buried. So where it's in gray means that there is a known record of someone being buried in that burial plot. Black means that there is a possible burial. So we're still trying to go through the records and know for certain. And then anywhere that's white, we don't have a record of burial at that time. But that doesn't mean that there's not anyone buried there. There was a lot of records didn't include burial plot on there. So that's something that we're trying to figure out. So just another glimpse at that. At the database, through the records, we're able to look at date of birth and death, and all kinds of different little bits of information about the people. So we're putting that all into the database, and so we're almost there. We've done about 700. We've identified 700 people so far, so we still got about 300 more to go. But as soon as we get that list complete, we want to publish that to the public, so that way you can look and maybe see if you recognize any names, or so this just kind of helps us to place those people back within the community. So going through those records already, we start to get glimpses at the identity of those that were buried. And through that, we've learned a lot. So originally, when we first went through the records, it seemed like it was majority white, the people that were buried there. But going through the records and seeing what information was recorded, we see now that the majority of people that are buried there were Black, but the biggest majority is children and infants. And so that has also been something we didn't know at first, but through the recording of date of birth and date of death, we've been able to figure out that a lot of people that we thought were adults are actually children. What we also see is, a pretty sizable number of European immigrants buried there as well. And so what this all points to is these sort of socioeconomic factors that led to someone being buried in the Potter's Field. And this just kind of shows where people came from. And, you can look at this to kind of see that history of Lawrence, of, that makeup of Lawrence, and, and the different cultures that existed here and had a part in defining Lawrence today. And so this has been one of those things that we also discovered through those records, is that they kept a record of where people were born. And so one thing we want to create is a map showing, all the little pins from all across the US where people came from, but as we can see across the world as well. And as Blair talked about, we do have a few headstones, and this just highlights that there's always been an element of care. We're not coming in claiming that we are, we're the ones that are giving a meaning to the space again. The fact that there are headstones is a monument to that the lives of these people were important then, and they still are important now, and that these were loved ones for many, that these were people of the community. And so we are just trying to be a part of that today. And so that element of care is what's guiding this and creating those signs out there, as we hope to help give that sort of monument of care to everyone there in the Potter's Field. So that's just a little glimpse into where we're at now. We're still sort of early in this project, still have a lot of work to do, but we want this project to be about the community, always connecting back with the community about what we're working on, what we've found so far, and what our next steps are. So our first step is to get that complete list, get that out into the community, start connecting with people more through these history harvests, and learning the deeper stories than just what we see through the records. And we've had some amazing help with people who collect obituaries and go through newspapers. Jean Klein has been such a great help in helping us to find these stories that people were honored with. And then, as Blair talked about, we found at least one headstone that had been covered. So working to identify any others, to reset those, so that way they can be those monuments to the lives of those buried there, and then having those signs in that podcast coming in the near future. And I believe Donna Ray put this quote in there. And so this really just highlights sort of what this project is about, that when you ask about someone who died by name, you honor the life they lived. And so we want to honor the lives of all those in the potter's field. So that being said, if there are any sort of questions about our project, about the work we're doing, anything like that, yes, you can share those now. We'll be having, for those of you who are watching this online but would love to be a part, we'll be having more History Harvest coming soon. So check out our page on the Watkins website that has information about our project. We have our email there that you can reach out to us about, or just keep looking at following the Watkins page online and stuff. On their Twitter and things, we'll share details about our upcoming projects, and would love to have anyone be a part of that. All right. Well, any questions